And if I may now turn to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Hugh Williamson. Hugh, until 2014, was Regius Professor of Hebrew at the University of Oxford and a student of Christ Church, and he is now a very active Regius Professor Emeritus. He is known as the author of many monographs and commentaries on the books of Chronicles and of Ezra and Nehemiah, and on the book of Isaiah, with the 3-volume commentary for the International Critical Commentary Series ongoing. Volume 1 has appeared already, on the Hebrew text of chapters 1 to 37. Over many years, Hugh has been actively involved in excavations at Lachish and Jezreel, and his passion for archaeology has helped us in so many ways for the Society, particularly in his distinguished service as chair of the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society for 19 years, and now as vice president. As a society, we owe a very great debt of gratitude to Hugh for his many services to this society. And so it's my pleasure to hand over to Hugh to give this lecture on the 60th anniversary of the Society's foundation.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, and hello everyone, wherever you are. I know some of you are very far away. It's good to see so many friends and colleagues around. Before I get into the lecture proper, perhaps I could just share 1 or 2 reflections, given that this is the 60th anniversary of the Society. In fact, we're a few days short of it. The first lecture of the Society was given in November 1961 by Yigal Yadin to an audience of 700 people, roughly. I see we've got just on 100 today, so we've got 600 to go to catch up with Yadin, but I don't think we'll get there. Yadin was at the time on sabbatical in London, and of course was a great friend of the real founder of our society, Richard Barnett, at the British Museum, and it's lovely to have Barbara Barnett with us, amongst others, this evening. Richard Barnett had contacts with many archaeologists working in Israel, and there wasn't at that time so much interest in this country and what they were doing. And Richard thought that was unfortunate, and so he began in a very informal way, when they came, and that they are often friends and close colleagues, to ask them to give a lecture and so on. And that, of course, has continued, though in a now slightly more formal way, to this day. So the first thing about the Society is we do try to share news and information about archaeological work, not just in Israel, but in surrounding countries as well. So that's the first point. Secondly, Yigal Yadin, while he was here, fired the enthusiasm of David Astor, who at that time was the editor of the Sunday newspaper, The Observer. He fired him with enthusiasm for Yadin's next project, which was to be the excavations of Masada. And it was that which began the whole business, which now is to a penny, of volunteers going to work on digs in Israel and elsewhere. That whole movement, which is now very widespread, really began through that visit when Barnett, Yadin and Astor got together. And that was much helped by a very long-term servant of the Society, Ashley Jones, who had a bookshop just across from the British Museum and who used to sort of organize a lot of the logistics of that. Incidentally, I just might mention, because some people say to me sometimes that obviously the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society is somehow a voice for Israel or for Israeli work. If I mention that when I was chair, Ashley Jones was the vice president, excuse me, Lord Allenby was our honorary president, and Nick Slope, whom we missed so much, he died prematurely, was the honorary secretary. Not one of the 4 of us was Jewish or Israeli or anything of the sort. So this is a purely academic exercise, very much so. So secondly, encouraging particularly students to go on digs in Israel has been one of our founding efforts, and we continue to give a few grants as we're able to encourage that. And then thirdly, of course, there's the whole business of publication. And initially it was on old before the invention of Xerox, almost cyclosiled sheets, which then developed into what was then called the Bulletin. And then eventually, particularly under Shimon Gibson's good work, it became the journal Strata, which Sarah's already mentioned. Now, if we could go to the shared screen and slides, please, David. When I retired as chair after many years, the committee very cunningly discovered a little known hobby of mine, which is vintage model yacht sailing. And so if we could have the first slide, they presented me with this marvelous yacht, which, as you can see, is called Strata, after the name of the society. And she does sail, as the next slide will show you, on the east coast of England, where I live. There's Strata with a Byzantine mosaic in the top sail, and she goes very well. So every time they call out the names of the races, our journal gets widely proclaimed. Now, that brings me closer to the subject of today's lecture, because in the town where I live, Southwold, I discovered some while ago that one of the two I'm going to talk about, Professor Driver, used to come on holiday every year here to Southwold. And he's mentioned in the local church magazine and so on. And I once met one of his granddaughters, who was an elderly lady, and I asked her, did she know where they came to stay? And she said, oh, yes, it was that house there. So if we'd have the next slide, they came to stay in this very, oh, I think we've jumped. Oh, yes, this is from Driver's widow, long after, saying how she used to love to come on holiday. And they lived in this stayed in this very imposing house, which completely by chance, if you have the next slide, is in the same road where I live, where the black arrow is. And that's where my grandparents lived and where I now live. So there's a sort of close personal connection, purely coincidental, with Professor Driver. Well, let's turn then to consider him and his contemporary A.H. Sayce. Driver became the Regius Professor of Hebrew in Oxford in 1883, and he held that position until his death in February 1914. His publications are very well known, and they've often been surveyed and evaluated. I have nothing fresh to say on any of that. Many appreciations of him were published soon after his death. I've listed some on the next slide. He was very much appreciated. You can see quite a few distinguished names there who wrote about him. And indeed, there are those who have worked on it in varying levels of detail since, as we'll show on the next slide. These are now up-to-date, recent evaluations of his work. His approach to the value of archaeology in relation to biblical studies has not received much attention, however. All these other works are on his works on Hebrew and the biblical texts and so on. And what I want to try and do is to fill that gap a little bit by way of a compare and contrast sort of study with A.H. Sayce, who I shall talk about in a moment. And as we shall see, interestingly, both these two scholars, distinguished in their own ways, changed their opinion during the course of their career on the subject we're considering. And if they had, at the start of their career, held the views they held at the end of their careers, the course of history would have been extremely different. The essential points of difference between them, in my opinion, are actually very much alive today in competing scholarly agendas. And so towards the end of the lecture, I may just reflect a little bit on that and offer a few comments on how we might learn from a past debate, even in our modern situation. So let me start with a consideration of how Driver came to be appointed to the chair. There's some irony in this point, as I've said, in that at that time, Driver actually had not written anything really on the Bible at all. He used to publish editions of rabbinical texts and from manuscripts in the Oxford Bodleian Library. And he didn't do work on the Bible until after he was appointed to the chair. His predecessor, Professor Pusey, held the chair for 52 years and died in 1882. In those days, one had to be an ordained Anglican priest to hold the chair because it was linked to the cathedral in Christ Church in Oxford. Being a crown appointment, the person was chosen, was appointed by Her Majesty the Queen, in this case, Queen Victoria, and she was advised in turn by her Prime Minister. So not at all the normal way that one gets appointed to a chair in the modern world. And when Pusey died, Driver was already, a picture of him here in his younger days, was already a deacon in the Church of England, but not yet a priest. He was offered the chair by Gladstone in October. He was ordained then in December, and the letters patent, as the English language has it, were issued in January 1883. Well, how did all that come about? The Prime Minister, the indefatigable Gladstone, took the task of finding a successor to Pusey very seriously. And there's a lot, he did all his letters by hand, and you wouldn't believe that the Prime Minister could write a dozen or more letters to just on the question of who should have the chair of Hebrew, but he certainly did, and they're all published. In a letter of the 4th of October, Gladstone wrote to the then Dean, that's the head of Christ Church, as we'll see on the next slide. He says, "I'm glad to say," this is Gladstone, "that the Hebrew chair has given me a great deal of trouble. This means that instead of finding it difficult to get a really good Oxford Hebraist, I find that there are at least 4 men of whom you first mentioned to me, I like this, Oxford men proper, all of whom stand high in Hebrew scholarship and are qualified thus far to sustain the honor of the chair." Well, in the next slide, you'll see he lists many others to whom he had written and the criteria on which he's going to work. That was his letter that Gladstone wrote by hand at that time. Now, he considered 4 people. We won't bother with 2 of them today. One was Driver, and the other was Archibald Henry Sayce, who was almost exactly the same age as Driver. The next slide has a picture of him when he was relatively young. And we know quite a lot about Sayce because he wrote a 500-page reminiscence that was published in 1923. So he tells us a lot about himself there. He was an extraordinary character. He had rather indifferent health, and so he spent much of his life abroad, particularly in Egypt. He was a fellow of Queen's College in Oxford, where he would usually come for about 1 month in the year in August when the weather was up to scratch. He was first of all a philologist, and only secondly one with an interest in archaeology. He could write in at least 20 ancient and modern languages. While still a schoolboy, I have grandchildren and I haven't ever told them this, he worked not only on Greek and Latin, but also Hebrew, Akkadian, Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit as a schoolboy. His expertise in philology led to his appointment as Deputy Professor of Comparative Philology in 1876. And then in 1891, he was offered a personal chair, the first chair in Assyriology, the language of the ancient Assyrians and Babylonians. There was no residence or lecturing requirement. As I say, he used to come to Oxford in August and give 1 lecture. Those were the days, I often think to myself, when you could have a chair like that. He claims to have written the first ever grammar of Sumerian, as well as one on Assyrian, and he was also in on many early finds and publications in the realm of biblical archaeology. If we could have the next slide, we see him more in middle age. For instance, he was the first scholar to work on the Siloam tunnel inscription, the inscription in Hezekiah's tunnel. He sat, he tells us, for 2 or 3 afternoons with candles in the water in the tunnel and he read, and he got quite a decent copy of that. It was improved slightly after, but he did well. Also, because he spent most of his life in Egypt, the famous Elephantine papyri, which we've had lectures on to this society more than once in the past, he published the first edition of some of those and very much else besides. He was a prolific author, but although he lived from 20 years or so after Driver had died, as we shall see in the next slide, he reached a good old age, he actually didn't publish much after Driver's death. They wrote a lot when they were contemporaries, and after that, really just Sayce's reminiscences. Well, now, Sayce had great respect for Pusey, the previous professor, and he used to go along to him for informal lessons. And in his book, he refers more than once to the fact that he was disappointed not to get the chair. People evidently lobbied for him, and Gladstone wrote to one of the lobbyists to say, "I have a great respect for Mr. Sayce's talents and learning, but under no circumstances could I give him an ecclesiastical appointment." Now, I should say that Sayce was an ordained clergyman, but Gladstone, who was rather conservative in his theological views, wouldn't consider Sayce because at that time, Sayce held to normal critical views about the way the Hebrew Bible was written. As I've said, meanwhile, Driver, who eventually was chosen, hadn't written anything on the Bible by then. He'd written a very famous book on the tenses of the Hebrew verbs, which he says was a teaching aid, but otherwise it was mostly work on later rabbinic manuscripts. Now, Sayce, in his reminiscences, reflects, of course, on this whole procedure. And I've got 3 or 4 slides, which I won't read them all, but if we could go to the next one, you'll see how he says that Pusey had thought that Sayce would always succeed him. Now, that may be Sayce misinterpreting polite comments by Pusey. I absolutely have no idea. But he was clearly unsafe. But he says that Gladstone, the Prime Minister, knew that Sayce at that time was one of the leaders of what he calls German critical theology at Oxford, and that therefore he was considered to be unsafe for the chair. He goes on, if we could proceed to the next slide, to say how disappointed he was when he learned he hadn't got the chair, but he's very gracious. And in the next slide, we'll see how he is slightly, if we could move on one, please, reconciled to it, because he accepts that Driver was one of the best Hebraists in the country. Sayce had hoped to introduce a more comparative philology, sort of Assyriology thing into the Hebrew teaching, but Driver was not really in that school. But then the next slide, he ends this long quote by these very interesting observations. "Little did either Gladstone or myself then foresee that the time would come when Driver would be the protagonist of German higher criticism, and I should be regarded as a champion of orthodoxy. Or that, and this is extraordinary, in the 90s, Gladstone would be my associate in writing an introduction to an American illustrated Bible. Gladstone wrote on the New Testament and Sayce wrote on the Old Testament, and expresses regrets that he had listened to other councils and not given me the Oxford Chair of Hebrew." Well, that's quite an interesting take on the whole business. With the benefit of hindsight, I think we would conclude that actually Gladstone made the right choice, even if for the wrong reasons, from Gladstone's point of view. Driver's work has survived and is still used and valued today, whereas only oddities like myself probably read much that Sayce himself has written. I can't help observing at this point that Sayce didn't have a very high opinion of Gladstone after that. He wrote on one occasion, "He would have made an excellent Archbishop of Canterbury. He made a very bad Prime Minister of the British Empire." Anyway, in later comments, he says, if we could do that, if we could just go to the next slide, please. He writes, can we move on? Oh, sorry, yeah, that's right. I couldn't help being amused by the irony of the fate. The orthodox driver of the past had become the dangerous heretic, whose biblical position, the heretic of the past, was now united with Gladstone in opposing. And yet he says, I had never changed my point of view. Now I'm going to question that in a moment. Right. Well, let's get some context for this work that they were doing in their interests in archaeology. Of course, archaeology wasn't part of the job description either for the Professor of Hebrew or for a Professor of Assyriology as such. But just reflect with me for a moment on the heady days in which they were living. In their junior years, the first serious excavations in what we now call Iraq were undertaken, and both the monumental and inscribed materials began to be brought into Europe, not least the British Museum, where one can see much of it still to this day. It was in 1872, when both were in junior college posts, that George Smith first announced his discovery of the Babylonian flood story, which of course has close similarities with the biblical flood story. The famous Cyrus cylinder was first published in 1880. I've mentioned that Sayce was the first person to read the Hezekiah Tunnel inscription, and he lived on a houseboat on the Nile with his library going up and down the River Nile, and so was in touch all the time with work that was going on there. I've mentioned the Elephantine papyri from Egypt, but other things as well. It must have been an extraordinary time to be like, almost every year, some find that we now take for granted was being unearthed. Now, as we see here, Sayce says he didn't change his opinion. But despite that, it's clear that in fact he did. His first public foray into our field came in a book, next slide please, which he was asked to write for the Religious Tract Society, Fresh Light from the Ancient Monuments. Now, my copy, which I've got here, is its 10th printing in 1900. And from the fact that it was printed more than 10 times, you can get an impression of how popular and widely read this was. It was a tremendous success. The preface has lots of rhetoric about striking confirmations of the biblical narrative, although Sayce allows that there was serious textual corruption in a way that doesn't affect either Akkadian or Egyptian sources. It turns out that for Sayce, archaeology really means written sources. He's not much interested in pottery or that kind of thing. It's the written sources that excite him. His tendency in this work, and he actually repeats himself in quite a few other books, is to work through the biblical narrative, aligning bits of its text with what he can glean from archaeological sources. Now, of course, it's not until well into the time of the Israel and Judean kings that he has any direct reference where the names of kings of Israel or whatever begin to crop up in Akkadian texts. In this book, the first one on the subject that he wrote, his tone is relatively moderate and it's primarily positive. He wants to illustrate the biblical text and to comment on its moral superiority. In other words, his writing doesn't really live up to his initial rhetoric, slightly overhyped about proving the Bible or anything like that. And all this was before the discovery of a famous collection of letters in Egypt called the Amarna letters. The Amarna letters, there's about 80 of them, were written by I don't know whether we call them kings or leaders of city-states in what we now call Israel, like Shechem or Jerusalem or places like that, to the Pharaoh in Egypt, who was then basically the nominal ruler of the area. They were only discovered later than this first book by Sayce. Books were to follow, and I've read them all, but I'll just single out a couple for this evening's purpose. If we could go to the next one, a far more substantial book called The Higher Criticism and the Verdict of the Monuments, originally published in 1893. And he uses two well-known academic ploys that I've seen in many similar books since. He claims that what he has written will satisfy neither the higher critics nor their extreme opponents. In other words, I'm an even-handed person going through the middle. And equally, he says, of course, he's writing as an archaeologist, not a theologian. I don't want any critics from the church. His first chapter is called Higher Criticism and Oriental Archaeology, and the second, The Antiquity of Oriental Literature. And in these, he clearly accepts what he calls one of the most assured results of the literary analysis of the Old Testament records has been the existence of documents of different age and authorship in the Pentateuch. In other words, he accepts what today would be called traditional source criticism of the Pentateuch. Later on, he points to parallels between the Genesis and Babylonian flood stories. He's happy to talk about two different versions of the flood story being combined in Genesis, and so on. And he says the same thing happens in the Book of the Dead and the Gilgamesh epic. So at this stage, he's still what Gladstone would disapprove of, if you like, a German higher critic. The Amarna tablets had just been discovered when he wrote this book, and he uses them to show that literacy and education were already at an advanced level in Western Asia by the time of Moses. They're probably in the 1400s or something like that. And so, you know, he uses them as background for Moses. So while his historical conclusions are fairly conservative, he's still working in some respects within a standard literary analysis as then understood and which he had long espoused. Now, in the next of his books, if we could have that I want to mention, The Early History of the Hebrews, 1897, we find a complete change of outlook. This actually book is his most formally academic of all those that I've considered, and it goes over the same ground again, although in greater detail. But this time, he claims that he's writing a purely archaeological history of ancient Israel. That doesn't mean quite what we might mean today by that. It means a retelling of the biblical story, illustrated and supported by archaeological sources, particularly written. And in this book, for the first time, he mounts a full-scale assault on conventional literary critical analysis of Genesis. I won't go through all the arguments, but for him, the Amarna letters show not only that Moses could write, but that it would have been perfectly understandable that he should have done so. The Tel El Amarna correspondence threw new light on the whole subject and revolutionized my view of it, he says. It was henceforth plain that the assumption of the late date of the literary use of writing was false, and that already in the Mosaic age, education was widespread. The main support of the so-called literary analysis and criticism had disappeared, end of quote. So you can see that that's really a complete change on his earlier view. So to sum up Sayce's position, we can say that he had a slight tendency to cover over the tracks of his own development in this field of research. In the heady days of early discovery, it was understandable that written sources recovered by archaeology should be his chief inspiration, and he made his own positive contribution to their elucidation. His approach to the Hebrew Bible by way of external history led him steadily to sharpen his rejection of the standard critical views about its composition, which initially he had espoused. Later work suggests that this movement in an increasingly conservative direction continued to deepen. His reputation, therefore, among scholars today whom I've looked at, who've obviously never read what he wrote, are not, I stress, that he was some sort of fundamentalist bigot. Very far from it. He accepted the importance of textual criticism. He accepted that some of the dates in the Bible were off key and so on. But his gradual disillusion with standard literary analysis, induced by what most would regard as a hopelessly optimistic evaluation of some elements of the biblical narrative, and that's what has led to his reputation as a real conservative. Now, let's turn to Driver. And I've got a picture of him at the height of his powers, as it were, as our next slide. Sorry, that was, there's Driver, a fine portrait that hangs in the Oriental Institute in Oxford. To some, it may seem odd that I should talk about Driver in the same breath as archaeology, because his great reputation was as a Hebraist and a biblical commentator. But it's striking that when Constance Schweich made a wonderful donation to the then very new British Academy to endow a lecture series in memory of her father, Leopold Schweich, and the Schweich lectures are a series that continues to this day and very well known in our field. It was to Driver that the Academy turned for the first Schweich lectures on the results of archaeological research bearing on the study of the Old Testament, which, as we'll see, when it was published, had a slightly different title, namely Modern Researchers Illustrating the Bible, the first of the Schweich lectures. Now, you might have thought that Sayce would have been the more natural choice as lecturer. But, for instance, he was at the time president of the Society of Biblical Archaeology. But Graham Davis has unearthed in his research on the origins of this lecture series that because Sayce was financially supported in his publication of the papyri by Robert Mond, an industrial chemist whose family firm later became ICI, advised Constance Schweich on the whole thing. And so it was deliberately written into the title deeds, as it were, of the lecture series, that they should be given by all scholars of whatsoever school of thought. And Graham Davis thinks that that may have been drafted precisely to accommodate a conservative such as Sayce. Well, be that as it may, Driver, who was a founding fellow of the Academy, as we see, gave them, and Sayce was never asked, in fact, to lecture. Besides his Schweich lectures, however, Driver left quite a lot of earlier data from which we can get an idea of his approach to the subject. On the one hand, in his commentaries on Genesis, but also to some extent on Samuel and Deuteronomy, as well as a more popular book on Isaiah, he commented pertinently on a number of points on archaeological matters, including especially remarks on Sayce's work relating to Genesis in his early history. Second, though, and less well known, is a long essay, more than 150 pages, in the volume we'll see next, called Authority and Archaeology, Sacred and Profane, edited by David Hogarth, and it's got chapters on lots of different areas, and Driver wrote on archaeology and the Bible. In this, Driver follows a program very much like that of Sayce, namely a trawl through parts of the Hebrew Bible to draw attention to archaeological data of relevance for comparison or illustration. He refers to Sayce quite often in the course of this, selecting places where he can do so as examples, where he can cite him in support of what he's saying. He was an Oxford colleague, and Driver clearly, on the whole, wants to be decent and polite about it. For instance, Genesis 14, where some kings come, it's a rather obscure chapter, but it's quite famous, and Sayce wrote a lot about it. Driver agrees that some of the names of the kings referred to there may be aligned with figures known from Babylonian sources. But at the end of that discussion, unlike Sayce, Driver adds that the narrative itself includes a number of historical improbabilities which no inscription has yet removed, that not one of the details of the expedition has received any corroboration from them, and that the only evidence that the chapter was historical is that which is supplied by the biblical text itself. If you've read Sayce on that chapter, you realize that Driver is quietly commenting on Sayce's approach and criticizing it. And the same would go for his treatment of the Joseph story and the Exodus story. He doesn't doubt that they happened. He cites all the same sources as Sayce, but he stresses that nowhere is the Exodus or those events mentioned in any source. And as far as the Amarna texts are concerned, he says you can use them to describe the state of Canaan in the pre-Israelite period, but not to speculate about their bearing on the composition of the Bible. Well, so the first 140 pages are fairly ironic in tone and surveying the material. And right at the end, he says, the reader will expect naturally some more definite reference to questions which are of present interest and will desire to know what bearing the archaeological discoveries of recent years have on the so-called higher criticism of the Old Testament, and whether on the whole they support or not the conclusions generally accepted by modern critics respecting the authorship and historical value of the books of the Old Testament. And here he becomes uncharacteristically forceful in tone. He even allows himself an exclamation mark at one point, which is really quite dramatic for Driver. He starts by drawing what ought to be the obvious distinction between direct and indirect evidence. Direct evidence is comparatively rare, and where it occurs, like the reference to the name of a king, it relates to subjects which no one's ever questioned in the first place. Most evidence from archaeology, however, is indirect. And he says that Sayce's fault was that he tried to maintain that indirect evidence was actually direct evidence. So against claims that archaeology has refuted the results of critical conclusions, Driver states that this rests, quote, almost uniformly upon misapprehension. Either the critics have not held the opinions imputed to them, or the opinions rightly imputed to them have not been overthrown by the discoveries of archaeology. And in a footnote, he says, examples of both misapprehensions abound, unhappily, in Professor Sayce's writing. Well, he then goes on to give some examples of that, which I won't delay on, particularly, as we'll see in the next slide, on chapter 23 of Genesis, which Sayce had built on a lot. And in the next slide, which I won't read in full, you'll see that Driver goes through it point by point to show that none of the points Sayce makes actually can be substantiated. So moving from specific examples to the general history which the narratives recount, Driver again accuses Sayce of great exaggeration. He finds the details collected interesting, but they do not contain the smallest evidence that either Abraham or the other patriarchs ever actually existed. Archaeology has shown that there were inhabitants in Palestine before the age of Moses, but that the Hebrew patriarchs lived in it, there is no tittle of monumental evidence whatever. They may have done so, but our knowledge of the fact depends at present entirely upon what is said in the book of Genesis. And then this devastating summary, which comes in our next slide. What Professor Sayce has done is firstly to draw from the monuments a picture of Palestine as it was before Moses, then to work the history of the patriarchs into it, and having done this, to argue or imply that he had proved the historical character of the latter. Driver returns finally to his distinction between direct and indirect evidence and concludes that Professor Sayce, unfortunately, has neglected this distinction. So even though Driver agrees that some critics are unnecessarily skeptical, he is insistent that they cannot be refuted along the lines that Sayce attempted. Now, a picture of Driver in his older age, as I draw a few concluding reflections. So how do we respond to this relatively fierce dispute? Well, things have come a long way since Sayce and Driver, but the fundamental points of disagreement remain alive, even if expressed sometimes with different language and not always quite so politely, I hasten to add. We have to acknowledge that archaeology is a fully fledged scientific discipline in its own right. It's not just the handmaiden of history. The questions posed before an excavation or survey are framed are according to a quite separate research agenda than the interests in important people and events in history. The idea that one digs in order to find traces of major events or exclusive deposits of the social elite is irresponsible, because it results in damage to the sources of other sorts of knowledge which archaeology is more suited to recover, and which once dug cannot be retrieved. Equally, modern history is not so much interested in these days in just what used to be called men and movements, but more in the life of the population as a whole, economic development, social concerns, and so on. And as it happens, archaeology is now properly undertaken, and social history in terms of the life of the majority of the population have a much closer fit than was the case between old-fashioned treasure hunting and a narrow biblical focus. Despite that, many of us still have a perfectly reasonable and understandable interest in the Bible and its history. So what are we to do there? And I want to suggest, in concluding, that there is a modified version that remains defensible. I want to interpret Driver's method, if I may, with different terminology. First, his distinction between direct and indirect evidence is entirely valid. There are some cases where we can make a direct match, but not often. And here it seems to me that where there is a direct match, there's no escape from a rather traditional historical method of evaluating sources and the like, but this is rare. Rather, my own approach would be to try to marshal the indirect evidence in a slightly different way than was possible for Driver. What archaeology can best inform us about is the gradual development of society in demographic, rural, technological, cultural terms. It traces change, and one can spot from those gradual changes when pressure points or other circumstances lead to the probability of a rapid change over natural development. You can predict that something dramatic is going to happen because of the way the society is developing. But of course, the precise way in which that happens requires a specific catalyst. And that catalyst, that thing that tips it over the brink, if you like, is usually beyond the compass of the archaeologist's purview. Just give you one example in concluding: the increasing complexity and interdependence of the rural settlements in the Central Hill Country in the early Iron Age, that's before the monarchy in Israel, allow us to predict that there was going to be a major change in the social structure to accommodate and regulate things. As the settlements grew in number and the population developed, clearly a change was needed. The catalyst, however, if I may turn to the biblical sources, was the equal development in what we today call Jordan of monarchy, which evoked the need in Israel for a comparable form of permanent leadership, what we would later call a king. And that provoked the Philistines in the lowlands to the west to respond to those new developments with the consequences which we know from the biblical story. In such a scenario, conditions for change and catalysts for change are complementary, and the evidence for each should be treated with full respect for its own methods. That seems to me to affect both the interpretation today of archaeological data and the assessment of the nature and reliability of the written biblical sources. And of course, there's lots of room for discussion on all that. But the discussion should respect the integrity of each source, as Driver clearly perceived, and not confuse them in such a way that either becomes contaminated. Driver's clear perception of this fundamental point of method is one we would do well to heed. In the current debates, which today seem often to generate more heat than light. As Roger Morey, who lectured several times to our society and who was the keeper at the Ashmolean Museum, wrote, and I finish with these words, which will come up on the screen in my final slide. Driver's two works, he says, remain required reading for anyone who sets out to understand the equivocal and delicate relationship that archaeology has had from the outset, both with its champions and its detractors in biblical studies. Thank you very much.
Apologies, I lost my screen there. Thank you enormously, Hugh, for a wonderful lecture, a real tour de force of this highly topical issue. We have already some hands up. David Friedman, would you like to give your question?
Sure. Hugh, thank you very much. That was wonderful. I was curious about the Alamarna correspondence and Sayce's conclusion.
To show
more than me.
No, more than the
Sorry. Maybe someone else's mic is actually on, accidentally on. So did Sayce decide that because the Alamarna letters existed, there couldn't be anything like a multiple source hypothesis? That doesn't seem like necessarily a safe conclusion. Why couldn't there have been multiple people writing multiple things that get combined? Or does he think because the Alamarna letters exist, no, Moses must have written the whole thing, just as it is?
His view, which is mistaken, as Driver points out, was that the whole so-called higher critical movement began on the assumption that in Moses' time, nobody could write. And therefore it was all written up much later and invented. I mean, that's putting it rather crudely, but that was it. When the Amarna letters were found, he suddenly begins to say, well, obviously people were writing then and Moses could write, and this undermines the whole critical enterprise. Now, I agree with you entirely, David. There's a bit of a jump in the argument here. But having initially just said, oh, well, people could obviously write in the 14th century. Well, I mean, no one had ever denied that. In fact, the Egyptians have been writing for 1,000 or more years by then. He makes this leap, and Driver very patiently shows that there is a disconnect between the evidence and the conclusion. Driver says, of course, people could write. No one ever doubted it. That's not the reason why we think there are two accounts, for instance, of the flood that have been combined, or two creation stories that have been put side by side in Genesis. That's on the basis of internal evidence of the literature. So you're quite right to call him out on that. He makes a totally illogical jump from the fact that from his houseboat he found texts of people who were writing, to saying, therefore, the first 5 books of the Bible could all have been written by Moses. I mean, there just isn't a logical connection between those two. So I mean, I agree with you entirely.
Could I ask you a brief follow-up then? So it should have been clear when they were choosing the Regius Professor that, I mean, I don't know, but Driver was actually more, I mean, I'm assuming he had the same views perhaps then as later, and he's very much closer to the documentary hypothesis of Wellhausen, whereas Sayce, higher criticism, actually not so much.
We don't know what Driver thought at the time of his appointment. When he was appointed, he'd written 3 books, one of which was a year after he got his BA. 2 of those books are editions of rabbinical texts, showing a great mastery of the Hebrew language, which everybody acknowledged, and the other, his book on Hebrew tenses, which he wrote as a teaching aid, and which has become a very important work in the field. And there's nothing whatever about composition. He had also written one article, which I didn't mention, attacking a German scholar, Giesebrecht, who had tried to say that the language of what are called the priestly parts of the Pentateuch must be late because their language was late. And Driver wrote an article, about 50 pages long, saying that that argument is not true, that the language, he's not denying that it could be late. He simply says the linguistic argument doesn't hold water. After he was appointed, he didn't write much for about 7 years. He did his commentary on Samuel, which is a fine work on the Hebrew text of Samuel, which came out of some lectures. He wrote a book for Sunday school teachers in America. But it was 7 years before he wrote his famous introduction to the literature of the Old Testament. And I can't prove this, but I have the very clear opinion that at the time of his appointment, he hadn't really thought about a lot of these questions, or at least not in detail. And he took 7 years working it all out and came to the conclusions he did. He dissociates himself from Wellhausen in a letter in many respects, but clearly is in that general ballpark. And I think it was only after he got the chair that he came to those views. And if he had had them at the time, Gladstone wouldn't have appointed him. But the irony is that Gladstone and Sayce later cooperated on this Sunday school Bible, which is amazing.
Thank you. May we invite further questions, please? Either put them in the chat or raise your hand as David did, or just speak. Perhaps I could pose a question then for now. What evidence, Hugh, is there of the activity of either of these men in terms of archaeological investigation? How close were they to the monuments themselves?
Driver was not. He did visit the Holy Land once. He sort of went as a tourist, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. He didn't take part. Whereas Sayce was very much in the thick of it. He lived most of his life on this houseboat on the Nile. So he was going up and down and seeing things long before they were published, and there was no internet in those days, of course. He traveled widely. He went to Japan and China at one time. He was also very interested in early sort of Hittite material and so on. He sat in the Siloam tunnel and wrote the thing out. So Sayce was much more, as it were, on the ground, but always in relation to written materials. I haven't found anywhere where he sort of discusses, you know, the architecture or ceramics or anything like that, which would have been not so prominent even in those days as today. Driver, of course, would have known the material in the British Museum. His son, G.R. Driver, who also wrote a book on Hebrew tenses and rather patronizing, said, of course, my father didn't know Akkadian. If he had, he'd have got it right. Actually, Driver, the father, clearly did know some Akkadian because he uses it in some of his books, so on. But it was not his speciality in the way that it was for Sayce. So Driver, if I can put it this way, came from within the biblical world. I mean, his scholarship on Hebrew and so on is, you know, still stands. Standard dictionary, the standard Hebrew lexicon he participated in and so on. And he analyzed the texts in themselves. Sayce worked much more in the broader picture, and he wanted to fit the Bible into that. And so came up with the conclusions he did, which unfortunately, as Driver shows, sometimes meant over-reading or even misreading the text. And that's really the nub of the problem between them, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, I missed a hand up from Jack Sasson, who would like to ask a question. Sheila, could you unmute him, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Williamson. I found this very illuminating and very interesting. I just have a comment to say how high in the government and in the public all these issues were being debated in those days. The reason I say that, because in France about the same time, the big fight was about a chair at the Collège de France between Scheil and Fossey and Operet was involved. And it's amazing that Clemenceau and other high officials did not want to have Charles involved because in fact, he was a Dominican. And they did not want to have a laity involved in the chair. So the contrast is interesting, but the whole world of public disputes about the Bible and Assyriology and what have you, were going on with fierceness and abandon. It's very striking.
Thank you. I wasn't aware of the French parallel, which I shall certainly want to read up more about because that's a very interesting angle on things. In this country, one shouldn't underplay the particular influence of Gladstone, who was Prime Minister 4 times and who spent a lot of his time in North Wales, where he had a huge library, I think about 10,000 volumes, wrote a book on Homer and so on, and managed to do that alongside, according to Sayce, very badly running the British Empire, which I Gladstone attended meetings of the Biblical Archaeology Society. He had a real personal interest in it. And he was a conservative high churchman, that's to say, very traditional in his views. How much he knew in detail about biblical scholarship, it's difficult to tell. But certainly, as you say, he took a great interest. And I mean, the number of letters he wrote to get this appointment, by hand, as the Prime Minister, writing to a lot of distinguished people, asking for their opinion and their advice and so on. He clearly took that all very seriously. His great counterpart, of course, was Disraeli, who was a converted Jew and whose family certainly had scholarly interests. And my colleague Martin Goodman has written about that to some extent in relation to Josephus. Politics wasn't, I mean, it was serious, of course, but it doesn't seem to have been so all-time consuming as it is today. And these leaders had time to read outside their field, as it were, in areas of interest. Disraeli was more writing novels, and Queen Victoria preferred him very much to Gladstone. Whereas Gladstone was clearly a man of some considerable learning and scholarship, and took a deep interest in who would be the Professor of Hebrew. Yeah, but thank you for the French one analogy, which I didn't know about.
So there's a question in the chat from Peter Feynman. Sayce was involved in the founding of the Egyptian Exploration Fund in 1882. How did that affect his scholarship?
Well, the quick answer is I don't know, because I haven't come across that particular detail. He was also president of the Biblical Archaeology Society for many years, I mean decades. Because he spent most of his life in Egypt, one can see how he had an interest in what was going on there, and he wanted to communicate it, and he, as well as his academic work, he also wrote at the more popular level. So I wouldn't say so much that it was membership of the society that affected him, as that he will have brought all that distinction and interest to the society. I'd, as it were, reverse your question and put it that way around, I think.
Going down the chat, we have another question about the agenda of the writer of Bereshit, but it's not clear what the question is. I don't know if the questioner can unmute.
Thank you. Thank you. I would actually phrase the question differently. The revision of the views of the historicity of Bereshit, of the Torah in general, clearly creates problems for the writers of Kings. So, according to the Torah, we have a festival called Passover, but then by the time we get to Josiah, he points out very clearly that there had not been a celebration of the Passover like this since anybody could remember. So there's, I read that, I mean, I haven't read any of these scholarly books, but one, we attempted to read that as a way of saying, yes, we know there's a mitzvah of Passover, but we're also aware that maybe many generations have not really known about it. Does Driver talk about these issues? Who does talk about these issues?
Yes, he certainly did, and people still do to this day. The kind of point you raise, but many others could be added to them, are precisely the kind of thing that Driver would have looked at and tried to reflect on them in order to bring all the material into a coherent historical order. The differences within Bereshit between the different, Genesis 1 vis-a-vis Genesis 2, you can't harmonize them. They're clearly two very important, very significant ways of accounting for creation. And Driver would say, well, one is from one source and one is from another. Now, in the modern world, these debates go on. Of course, a lot more data are brought into bear now than were available then. But your observation, if I may say so, Daniel, is precisely the kind of internal textual analysis that Driver started from,
yes.
Rather than trying to, as it were, smooth everything out. So I mean, your Driver's book, The Introduction to the Literature of the Old Testament, still today brings much data of value on exactly the sort of question you ask.
I think you're telling me go read.
If you want, I can supply you with the reading list. I'll tell you an excellent place to
yes,
start. My good friend Richard Friedman wrote a book called Who Wrote the Bible, which is on sale in airports. It's a wonderfully readable book.
Yes.
He wrote it was, he told me, he said, well, I used to go to dinner parties and people would say, what do you do? And with a dread, he'd sort of say, well, I studied the Bible, thinking that would be a conversation killer. And he actually found people were fascinated with this. Now, one may agree or disagree with the way Dick answers the questions, but as a readable introduction to the kind of question, it's as good as any.
Yes, I've come across the book. I've read. I think I have read that quite a few years ago. Right. But what do we know about the character who really wrote this? Who wrote the stories? Maybe Ezra or a crowd of people. And what was the agenda? That was really my question on the chat. Was what was the agenda of these people who did write Bereshit?
Well, now you're asking me to summarize 150 years worth of scholarship in a minute, which is a bit...
Of course. What else?
The agenda, if I was to put it in a sentence, was to preserve texts, rituals, laws, and other material which had come to be valued by the community.
To give the Babylonian community a backstory?
If it was when they were in Babylon, yes. If it was when they were in the land, equally, yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
I see Jonathan has his hand up.
Yes, Jonathan Stöckel.
Thank you very much indeed, Hugh, for this wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed it. I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about to what extent Driver and Sayce interacted with their continental colleagues, specifically on these questions. I presume that Sayce would have found that much more difficult from his houseboat, but maybe my prejudice comes into place there about houseboats, and you can tell us more about those.
Yes, having lived on a houseboat myself in Oxford. Well, I can't say, as far as Sayce is concerned, he was respected, as far as I can gather, for his language, his philology. His work on Sumerian, and which actually people tell me nobody understood Sumerian then, but anyway, he wrote about it, and Assyriology, Akkadian, Hittite, and so on. At that philological level, I think he was a dialogue partner. I can't honestly tell you I've come across anything in particular on this more archaeological side. As far as Driver is concerned, we have letters from Wellhausen to William Robertson Smith. And in the first one, after that article that I mentioned, Wellhausen is very dismissive and says he'd make a better mathematician than a biblical scholar. But after he published his introduction, Wellhausen says it's by far the best thing there is, and it's much better than Cornell and other German ones. And he obviously becomes very, very positive about him. Driver was in constant dialogue with colleagues on the continent, particularly in Germany, people like Delitzsch and others. I mean, unfortunately, as far as I can, I try to chase letters of Driver. I'm sure he had all his correspondence destroyed after his death. In all the normal places, everything starts after his death, and none of his letters are, but sometimes you can get letters from elsewhere. But he seems to have been a lively correspondent and corresponded with a number of German colleagues. But again, more at the level of literary analysis and Hebrew and so on, rather than archaeology. Someone like Celine would be the interesting, if one could find stuff from him to see what he would say, because he's the sort of person that they would dialogue, but I haven't come across anything yet.
There are quite a lot of comments praising this wonderful lecture. But here's a question from Martin Hyder. Do you know of any discussion or disputes of Sayce and Driver about some of the most discussed anachronisms of the patriarchal period, such as Philistines, Aramaic, and camels?
The answer is that they do refer to these. Driver in particular, who wrote a commentary on Genesis, where the anachronisms you mostly refer to appear, if they are anachronisms, of course. I'd have to get the book off and see exactly what he said, but very much alive to all that. And incidentally, Driver's commentary on Genesis, which many more conservative church people sort of thought was undermining that, he got a lot of, and it's praised very widely, of people saying, we thought we had to give up the Bible because it's just clearly so out of date. And now you've explained it in a way that we can take it seriously again. So, it had it wasn't meant to be apologetic, but it had that purpose. I'd have to check, and thank you for raising the question, precisely what Sayce said about camels or about the Philistines. These are standard quote anachronisms in Genesis, and I can't answer that directly, but he will certainly have said something about it somewhere.
Thank you. And David Friedman has some questions.
Only if no one else has one. Two brief questions. One is on the opposite side of the title page of one of Sayce's books, there was an ad for a book about the Hebrews and Herodotus, and I wonder if you know what he argues there. And the second question was the Maury's comment at the end, the two books of Drivers that are absolutely important today. Are they Introduction to the New Testament and the book on tenses?
No, they're the two I referred to. When I said the two books, that was outside the quotation marks. That was I said the two books I've considered today, which Maury then refers to. So it's the Schweich lectures and this. The essay is actually longer than the Schweich lectures. The Schweich lectures are about 80 pages. The essay in the Hogarth volume is about 150. So it's those two that Maury is referring to. It's a very nice little book that, it's slightly older now, Roger Maury, A Century of Biblical Archaeology. He tells the story of how this went from early days up to the time he was writing. It's a very nice introduction to that subject by an extremely well-informed scholar who died far too young, sadly, just a year after retirement, which was very sad. Herodotus, the book is that book. I must go and look. That's by Sayce? I haven't read it. I'm sorry.
Seems to be, yeah, the Egypt of the Hebrews and Herodotus.
I'd have to go and look at that again. I'm sorry, I can't tell you more about that. I've got quite a few. He wrote the same book over and over again with a different title. I exaggerate slightly, and I've sort of plowed through most of them, but I'm afraid I've missed that one. Thank you for drawing my attention to it. I should look at it. Of course, Herodotus in Egypt has been often studied, and the definitive work now is by Alan Lloyd in Cardiff or Swansea, who's done several volumes on all that. And it's a very important subject in its own right.
Nick Brett. Can we unmute you?
Yes. I've got a paper which is done by Sayce in 1909, and he goes into anthropology and purity of blood and states that the people in South Judah were Amorites because of the squeezes that were done on the pylons at Karnak. So he seems to have sort of gone really sort of completely overboard and not done any textual analysis. This is just something he sort of plucked out the air.
He did at the time important work on the Hittite stuff and what he called the Van inscriptions. Some of it successful and some of it not in the light of subsequent scholarship. And I suspect I'd need to refresh my memory of that particular point, that, you know, he got one of these things on the brain and saw it everywhere for a while.
Yeah.
I don't think I could say more than that. That how it links to Karnak, I'm not at all sure. I agree with you.
He was with, well, there were squeezes done by Petrie about the heads of the people that from the cities that were
yes.
And he says they are Amorite. So
yeah.
People in South Judah were really Amorites.
The question of the depiction of ethnic types, if I may call them that, on Egyptian and later Assyrian reliefs is actually an important topic, and one can try to determine the makeup of the groups that they were opposing and so on, and work is done on that. The Lachish reliefs that we have in the British Museum have been studied from that perspective as well. So I presume he's an early forerunner of that particular line of research, but I wouldn't like to comment on whether he was right or wrong on the matter.
Yeah, I think he was sort of, it wasn't a particularly profound piece of writing. It was more of a sort of, I think it was something he just came across and wanted to get it out of his system.
Fair enough. He wrote a lot. That first book that he wrote for the Religious Tract Society, he tells us later he wrote it in 3 weeks. Well, I don't know when any of you last wrote a book in 3 weeks, but he clearly wrote hard and fast, as we might say.
David Blyton wrote a lot of books in 3 weeks.
Thank you. We have a quotation from Liz Freed, which she shared in the chat. I don't know if you want to react to it, Hugh. The topography of ancient Jerusalem has given rise to many controversies, some of which are not yet settled. This is a quotation from Sayce himself. It must therefore be remembered, he says, that all the views presented in this chapter are not likely to meet with universal acceptance, and that further exploration and excavation in the Holy City are needed before the question can be finally settled.
2 comments. First of all, that is characteristic of Sayce's approach. The popular press about Sayce is that he was a sort of conservative bigot. He wasn't. He was, I think, a gracious man. The book, his Reminiscences, is a wonderful read. I'm talking about a name dropper. You've never come across anything like it. But he's always polite and kind about even those with whom he disagreed and so on. So he was what here in England we call a proper gentleman. Secondly, of course, the question of the exploration of Jerusalem is indeed a very topical matter. And of course, Liz has recently written on the book of Nehemiah, and Israel Finkelstein, extremely distinguished archaeologist at Tel Aviv University, has written rather controversially that Nehemiah, whom Liz has been writing about, who famously is supposed to have built a wall, Finkelstein says there was no wall. The wall has Hasmonean, much, much later. Now, there are problems with Finkelstein's view on that, I think, and I think Liz would probably agree with me on saying there are problems. But that kind of debate goes on, and Sayce is only saying what remains true to this day. I don't know whether Finkelstein is listening this evening. His extraordinary outcome, having realized that the text of Nehemiah is not just got a list of wall builders, which one could say is late, but that the whole narrative is about the wall building. He now thinks that the Jerusalem of Nehemiah was under what we today call the Temple Mount, and therefore not accessible for excavation. And therefore, maybe he did build a wall, but we shall never know. I find that a really remarkable get out by Professor Finkelstein, if I wrote that as a conservative, as a way round a problem, he would blast me to seventh heaven for that sort of get out clause. But he resorts to it himself, which I find an interesting observation. But Sayce was right at the time. Of course, it was only shortly before Sayce's time that we even knew that the ancient city of David was south of the modern old city. And that Mount Zion wasn't where it is today, but was on the other hill and so on. I mean, that was all quite new news. And Sayce, sitting deciphering the Siloam Tunnel inscription, contributed to that rediscovery of the ancient city of David. Today, there are endless disputes about the size and extent of the city in David's time, if there was a David. In the late monarchy period, the time of Hezekiah, had it expanded, and in the Persian period, the post-exilic period, the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, was it big or small and so on. These are interesting and endless debates where text and archaeology are still appealed to. Just to give you one recent example, the Valley Gate is a gate that is mentioned in Nehemiah as part of Nehemiah's wall, and which has long been identified with a gate that the British archaeologist Crowfoot excavated on the western side of the city of David. And so we thought that was it. My archaeological mentor, Professor David Osishkin of Tel Aviv University, has written to say it's not a gate at all, it's the foundations of another building, and the Valley Gate wasn't there at all. So there has to be archaeological analysis in its own right to describe, is this a gate or is it something else? Perfectly reasonable question to ask. There has to be textual analysis, in this case of the book of Nehemiah and its composition and date, and then brought together, and not immediately reading one on top of the other. Each is a discipline in its own right, and they should be studied in their own right before they're combined. So thank you for raising that, Liz. That's a nice quote of Sayce, and he was right.
Liz, would you like to say anything?
Well, just I agree with Hugh, and I appreciate your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for your quotation. We have a little time left for questions if anyone else would like to come in here or comments. No?
I think everyone wants to take advantage of the budget that was given today in this country, where tax on some forms of alcohol has gone down. I think everybody's
rushing out.
I shouldn't blame them.
Well, nevertheless, I mean, we've had I think a large number of questions now, which really attest to the richness of your lecture, Hugh, and the excitement that it's generated, and huge reflection, I'm sure, to go on afterwards as well. It's been a wonderful lecture in honor of this great occasion of the 60th anniversary of the Society, and on behalf of us all, huge thanks to you for marking it in such a very special way.
Thank you.
And finally, it's my duty to announce to everyone that on Thursday, the 11th of November at 5 o'clock on Zoom, we have a lecture by Professor Carol Myers, Work and Worth, Women's Household Activities in Ancient Israel.
Oh.
So very much hope to see you there. And once again, enormous thanks to Hugh for an absolutely fantastic lecture marking this very special occasion. Thank you.
Thank you.